Hello good people and welcome back to this unit, and that's going to be unit 9, and here we're going to be talking about swaps. Now we've touched on futures, forwards and options. We played with the pricing of futures, and we touched on special kind of futures contract which are interest rate futures. And within those interest rate futures we also touched on euro dollar futures contract, right, which were a little more specific than the traditional interest rate futures that we looked at. And we talked about the differences between the interest rate futures and the forward rate agreement. In this unit we're going to touch on swaps and what a swap contract. And we've remembered that I think we've talked about this in our very first unit, first or second unit we touched on this. A swap is nothing else but an agreement to exchange cash flows at specified future times. Remember, times here is in plural, according to certain specified rules. And if we go back to our board here, we remember what our swap agreement is. We have two parties, A here and B. A, and they enter into an agreement. A has a loan, and that loan needs to be paid at a fixed rate. So A has a liability that needs to be paid at a fixed rate. Let's call that fixed rate. And B has a liability. Let's make sure we have that A. And B has a liability that needs to be paid at a floating rate. A decides that they really don't want to be working with a fixed rate, right? And so they will rather work with a variable rate versus fixed rate. And B really doesn't want to deal with variable rates, but rather would prefer fixed rate. So these two parties may enter into an agreement. And let's say the loan that A took was for $1 million. And the loan that B took was for $1 million. So they have the same notional amount. And so they could enter into an agreement, and those loans, for example, are due for a period of time, let's say 2 years. And that's also a 2-year loan. And so these two parties may enter into an agreement that allows them to exchange this stream of cash flows in order for A to transform this liability, that's a fixed liability, into a variable liability that they really want. So they have a fix and they want, but they want a floating. And B has a floating, but B wants a fixed rate. So they can exchange these cash flows over a period of time, which is the life of this loan. Now, the cash flows are exchanged in terms of interest on the notional amount. The notional amount itself is not exchanged. And how would that work for this agreement, for this 2 years agreement? Well, for this 2 years agreement, what we're going to have is the following. We're going to say they enter into an agreement. Typically, these payments are made every 6 months. And so every 6 months, they're going to be exchanging cash flows that are equivalent to the interest payments on that notional amount at the specified rate. So we're going to have the following. First cash flow, second cash flow, that's the first year. Third cash flow, fourth cash flow, that's the second year. And that's going to be 0.5, that's going to be 1.5, and that's going to be 2. So what's going to happen here, I'm just going to remove this. What's going to happen, make sure I have that here so you know it's floating rate here. What's going to happen here is that party A would rather have a floating rate. And so party A is going to offer to party B to pay its floating rate, right? Or at least a proportion of that. And so A is going to offer to pay the floating rate. And in exchange for the floating rate, B is going to offer to pay the fixed rate that A doesn't want. So B is going to pay the fixed rate. Now, they are not exchanging apple to apple, so they are not exact amount that they exchange, but that's the idea. So the cash flows of A are going to go from the fixed to the floating at every point in time, and we're going to have another floating here. And the cash flows of B are going to go from fixed, from floating, which is that, to fixed, and they're going to be a fixed here, and we're going to have fixed cash flow here. And this is essentially what a swap agreement is, conceptually. Now, this happens every period, all the way until the maturity of the contract. And these floating rate that are typically used here are LIBOR rate. And we're going to work with an example that details exactly how that is. But conceptually, that's the idea. The LIBOR rates are applied to the notional amount in order to compute what the actual exchange is going to be. That is when the agreement is entered into by these two parties directly. But we know that the financial market is not that easy to get into this kind of agreement that is complex between the two parties, because these two entities might not know that they have the cash flows that they could exchange, right? Or they have loans that are structured in a way that those cash flows could be exchanged, or a swap agreement could be entered into. Say, for example, a company like Apple may not know that a company like Amazon has the kind of cash flow that they may be interested in, right? Or the kind of agreement could enter into an agreement with a company like Amazon. So what they may need is a middleman that would help structure those agreements. And that middleman that will help structure those agreements is what we refer to as central counterparties. And so we're going to have a middleman here, which is essentially a financial institution. And that financial institution is going to take essentially take on the risk of managing this transaction between these two parties. Now, this financial institution doesn't do that for free. So the financial institution is going to earn a spread between the rates that are paid by the two parties. Now, let's work a detailed example of this in order to understand exactly how this would work. Let's say we have two companies. We have company A, or let's call that Apple. And we have another company, let's call that Intel. Apple and Intel have loans with different organizations. And so I'm gonna rewrite this, or I'm gonna draw this a slightly different way here. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna say Apple AAPL, and here we're going to have Intel. Apple has a loan, and the loan that Apple has as of today is a variable rate. It's at a variable rate. We just talked about the variable rate there, and we said that those variable rates are typically LIBOR rate. So Apple needs to be making payments. So those payments that Apple needs to be making are going to be made at the variable rate. So it's called that LIBOR plus 1%. That is the rate that Apple has to be paying on a loan. Let's call the notional amount here equal to 100 million. Apple took a loan from one entity, and Apple is paying a floating rate interest on that loan that is equal to LIBOR plus 1%. So at any point in time, we look at what the LIBOR rate is, we add 1% to the LIBOR rate, and we compute, essentially, we multiply that value by the notional amount, which is 100 million, and we find the amount of interest that Apple has to pay at that point in time on that loan. Intel, on the other hand, has a fixed rate loan on the same notional amount, And let's see that that interest rate for Intel is at 4%. So Intel has a 4% loan. And so at this point, we realize that, or Apple realizes that, well, we do not quite want to be working with the variable rate, because we believe that LIBOR rates are very volatile. We have less certainty around our cash flow stream, and so we want to have a fixed rate. We really do not want to have a variable rate. We want to have a fixed rate. And so that's what their model suggests to them. Intel, on the other hand, says, well, we do not quite want to have this fixed rate, right? Our model suggests to us that we are better off by engaging in a floating rate market, where we will be paying floating rate over a period of time for this loan. Now, one could say that they could essentially just retire, pay off the loan, and then borrow at the terms that are favorable to them. That is, Apple could pay off the 100 million and borrow another 100 million at a fixed rate, right? Or Intel could pay off the 100 million and borrow another 100 million at a variable rate. And so the reluctance that these companies may have to do that is related to, say, prepayment penalties. So Apple may be charged a penalty for paying off the loan early, or Intel may be charged a penalty for paying off the loan early. So that might constitute a barrier for Apple or Intel to restructuring their loan in that manner. A solution for that problem is essentially entering into a swap agreement, where Apple and Intel would essentially exchange its cash flows. Now, how would these entities do that? Well, for these entities to do that, they would have to know that they can engage with each other directly and be able to structure an agreement that would work for both parties. Now, how likely is it that Apple is to know that Intel has a loan of the same notional amount at the rate that is a fixed rate, and that Intel is really not interested in the fixed rate, Intel is interested in the variable rate? Not quite likely. So what Apple or Intel would do is find a financial intermediary that would help structure this deal for them independently from each other. And so the middleman, which is a financial intermediary, would put together the agreements that are independent from each other. That is, the middleman is going to create a contract for Apple, and the middleman is also going to create a contract for Intel. Now, the agreement that Apple and Intel both have with the financial intermediary are independent from each other. If one entity defaults, it doesn't affect the agreement that the other entity has with the financial intermediary. And so that is the distinction that we have to place there. And so let's insert a financial intermediary. So we're gonna do this. I'm just gonna move this a little further out here, and we're gonna squeeze in a financial intermediary here in the middle. Let's call that financial intermediary. Let's call that financial intermediary here Citibank. Now, Citibank is the financial intermediary. And so what we're gonna do is say Apple enters into a swap agreement with Citi. Remember, Apple has a loan that is at a variable rate or a floating rate, and Intel has a loan that is at a fixed rate. So what we're going to do is we're going to say Apple is going to enter into a swap agreement with Citi. So we're going to create a swap here, and we're also going to create another swap here. Now, Apple wants to have a fixed rate. Apple is not interested in a variable rate. So what Apple would want to do is for Citi to take away the portion of the rate that Apple currently has to pay that is variable. That portion of the rate is LIBOR. So what Apple would want for Citi is to be receiving LIBOR from Citi. because Apple received LIBOR from Citi, this is not variable anymore, right? Because whatever it is, we're receiving the same amount from Citi, so we are protected. It doesn't matter what it is, we're receiving that same amount, we're protected. So Apple is going to be receiving LIBOR from Citi. In exchange for that, what's going to happen is Apple is going to be making a payment this time that's going to be at a fixed rate to Citi. And let's say that fixed rate is found out to be equal to 5%. I'm going to use a different color here to make it a little more obvious. So Apple is going to be making a payment here of 5% to Citi. So ultimately, what do we have? Well, Apple initially had, let's call that AAPL. Apple initially had a loan of LIBOR plus 1%. So they had to pay LIBOR plus 1%. And because they had to pay that, we're going to put a negative sign in front. That's what they had to pay. That was their loan. They were able to structure a swap agreement with Citi that said that in exchange for receiving LIBOR, they will be paying 5% to Citi. Now, the 5% is on the notional amount, right? So 5% of $100 million. So what do we have here? They will be receiving LIBOR. So they will be receiving LIBOR from Citi. And in exchange from LIBOR, they will be paying the 5%. So they're going to spend a payment of 5% again. So minus 5%. So this first portion here is the loan. This second portion here is the swap. So overall, where does Apple lie? Well, they're going to be paying minus LIBOR minus 1%. So I just multiply the negative sign here. Plus LIBOR minus 5%. So what do we have? Minus LIBOR plus LIBOR cancel each other. So we got rid of the variable rate. And where are we? What are we left with? We're left with a net minus 6%. So Apple was able, by adding the swap agreement, to convert a payment of a variable rate into a 6% fixed rate. That is for Apple. Now, how about Intel? Well, Intel would do the following. Well, before we get to Intel, why would Citi do this in the first place? Well, Citi would be interested in doing this only if they can match this agreement to another agreement by a third party, in this case Intel, in order to earn a spread, right? Citi would not get into this agreement if it was not in some form beneficial to the middleman. And so there is a fee, or there is a premium that has to be paid to Citi for this agreement. And so where does that come from? Well, it comes from the agreement that Citi enters into with Intel. And let's look at that for a second. Well, Intel, on the other hand, is going to have the following. Let's say Intel has a fixed rate that they don't quite like. They want a variable rate. And so what does that mean? Apple had a variable rate, but they needed a fixed rate. So they got a variable rate from the middleman. Intel this time has a fixed rate. They don't want a fixed rate, which means they're going to receive a fixed rate from the middleman. So we're going to put an arrow here so it says that they will be receiving a fixed rate. And let's say that the fixed rate that they are receiving from Citi is at 3%. And in exchange for that fixed rate, they will be essentially paying a variable rate. And we talked about that variable rate earlier. We said that variable rate is always going to be LIBOR. So we're going to say LIBOR. In exchange for the fixed rate that takes care of this issue, they're paying variable rate, which is LIBOR. So overall, where does Intel lie? Well, they had a negative 4% to pay, so there's a 4% loan negative because that was an outflow. And in addition to that, they entered into a swap agreement. What was that swap agreement? Well, the swap agreement was the following. They were to receive 3% from CD. So we're going to say 3% here. That 3% here. And in addition to that, they were to pay LIBOR to CD. So we're going to have minus LIBOR. So overall, what do we have? Overall, we have minus LIBOR minus 4% plus 3%. And so net we have minus LIBOR minus 1%, which is really minus LIBOR plus 1%. So Intel will be paying, that's why we have negative sign here, paying a variable rate that's equal to LIBOR plus 1%. CD has structured the swap agreement with Intel in such a way that they will be receiving LIBOR rate from Intel and turn around and pay a fixed rate to Intel. And so overall, Intel will be paying a floating rate, which is what they wanted, right? They had a fixed rate and they wanted a floating rate. Now they have the floating rate in LIBOR plus 1%. And Apple had a floating rate and they wanted a fixed rate. Now they have a fixed rate of 6%. How about CD? Now, through this all, we remember this was again the loan, right, for Intel, and this here was the swap. Where does CD come from? Come in here. So CD, which is the middleman that helped put together these deals, is going to show up about here. And so for CD, what do we have? CD essentially entered into two different swaps. First swap with Apple and the second swap with Intel. And so CD is going to reconcile this swap transaction. And so where do we lie? Well, CD received 5% from Apple, 5% from Apple, and CD paid LIBOR to Apple minus LIBOR. And this was the Apple transaction. In addition to that, CD received LIBOR from Intel, and CD paid 3% to Intel. And so this was the Intel transaction. We have the first swap here, and we have the second swap. So overall, where does CD lie? Overall, we have plus LIBOR minus LIBOR, they cancel each other, plus 5% minus 3%, so we have a 2% premium or spread. So CD essentially earns a 2% premium or spread from this transaction as a fee for establishing this agreement. And this is essentially what this would look like. Now we see that Apple was able to convert a liability that was at a floating rate into a fixed rate liability, and Intel was able to transform or convert a fixed rate liability into a floating rate liability. Now this though shows us what the outcomes are in terms of percentage, right? Now, you also remember that we always quoted annually. So these are annual rates. And the negative sign here simply suggests that it is a liability to Apple, it is a liability to Intel, and it's a positive sign here, so it's a profit to Citi. Now, let's go a little further and let's see how this is actually going to be implemented. And the way we're going to implement this, I'm going to clean this up here. The way we're going to implement this is going to be as follows. Let's imagine the scenario where we are working with a 2 years agreement, a little bit like what we had earlier. And our 2 years agreement is going to look something like this. We have it today here, and we have our first quarter, first half period, so that's 1 year, 1.5 years, and this is going to be 2 years. Actually, I'm going to move this a little further out here. And so here we're going to be today. This is when we enter into the agreement. And we're going to work with Apple only for this in this case. And I'm going to ask you to try to figure out what these cash flows are going to be represented for Citi, and also for our middleman, which is, and also for the other party of the transaction, which is Intel. So here we're working for AAPL, which is Apple. Now, today we're locking an agreement. That's a swap that we entered into between Citi and Apple, right? Because you remember that the swap agreement, they're independent. Apple enters into one agreement with Citi, and Intel enters with another agreement with Citi. Those two swaps have nothing to do with each other. So that's the contract that these two entities entered into. Actually, let me put that contract up here. And we're going to call that a swap. And they entered into this date today. This typically happens, or the transaction, the exchanges are typically done every 6 months, so semi-annually. So this is going to be half a year, 1 year, 1.5 years, and 2 years. And remember that our notional amount is equal to 100 million. That's our notional amount. What was the agreement about? Well, in our agreement, what did we say? Apple here was to pay 5% to Citi and receive LIBOR from Citi. Let's say we are here, and as of today, the LIBOR rate for the next year, which goes all the way to this point, is given at, say, 5%. So this is a 5% LIBOR. And at this point, we can compute what is the cash flow that's going to be exchanged on this day for this semi-annual period for Apple. What is the net outcome for Apple? If LIBOR is at 5%, that is the annual rate, that's our LIBOR rate, what do we have? Well, we remember that we're going to be receiving, Apple is going to be receiving LIBOR from Citi, right? That's what we had. Apple is receiving LIBOR from Citi. So Apple, we're going to have from, I'm going to do this a little further down here. Let's say from Citi. Apple is going to be receiving 5% annually, which is 2.5% semi-annually. So Apple is going to be receiving 2.5%, right? What is Apple supposed to be paying to Citi? Well, Apple is supposed to be paying 5% to Citi. And so Apple is going to be paying minus 2.5% to Citi. Next, what else do we have with respect to Apple? They received 5% from Citi. They paid 5% to Citi. And what else did they have? They had to pay their loan, right? Because that was the swap. That's the outcome of the swap. Now, what's the outcome of our loan agreement? They have to pay LIBOR plus 1%. LIBOR is essentially 5% plus 1%. That makes it at 6%, right? That is annually. So we divide by 2. That's going to be minus 3%. So they're going to have to pay here minus 3%. And that's going to be our variable rate that we were trying to get rid of. And so the net amount that we're going to have, essentially this is going to be that the yellow there is going to be from city. I'm going to do this here from city. The white there is going to be to city. And the purple there is going to be the loan payment. And these two would make up our swap. And here we're going to have our loan. So what is the net outcome for this organization? Well, the net outcome is going to be plus 2.5% minus 2.5%. These cancel each other. So the net outcome is going to be minus 3%. And so the minus 3% here is going to be the amount of money that we will be paying on our notional amount. And our notional is 100 million. And so 3% of 100 million, that's about 3 million. So our cash flow for this period here is going to be minus 3 million. That is our cash flow here at the end of the first period. Now, at this point, we revisit what the LIBOR rate is. So we know what the cash flow for this first period is going to be, right? That first cash flow, we know what it's going to be. How about this second cash flow? Well, for the second cash flow, we're going to have the same process. Let's say at this point we realize that LIBOR rate for the next year, because remember LIBOR is updated, LIBOR rate for the next year, let's say it's at 8%. If LIBOR for the next year is at 8%, what is the cash flow, the net outcome for Citi at that point in time? Well, the net outcome for Citi at this point in time is going to be the following. Well, the second cash flow, Apple is going to be receiving 8% divided by 2, so they're going to be receiving 4%. That is LIBOR. Remember, LIBOR is 8% divided by 2 because it's semi-annually. And Apple is going to be paying to Citi, which is LIBOR, and Apple is going to be not LIBOR. Apple is going to be paying to Citi 5% here, and that's 5%, the fixed rate. So they're going to be paying to Citi plus minus, because they're paying 5%, which is 2.5%. That's fixed there. And what about the loan? Well, the loan was LIBOR plus 1%. Remember? So the loan was LIBOR plus 1%. And so they're going to be paying LIBOR, which is 8% plus 1%. That makes it 9% divided by 2, which is, in this case, 4.5%. So they're going to be paying minus 4.5%. And so what do we have? The net here is going to be equal to, we are at 6 plus 6, 4.5% minus 2.5%, that's 7%, plus 3%, so we are at a minus 3% again, multiplied by 100 million, and we realize that we are paying 3 million again. So from a 3% LIBOR to an 8% LIBOR, Apple was able to avoid having a variable rate and lock in that fixed rate. And the fixed rate here is at 3%. But now remember, it's a 3% semi-annual, and so annually is going to be minus 3% times 2, which is equal to minus 6%, which is exactly what we had here at minus 6% for Apple. And so that is what is going to happen for Apple every period. Now let's look at the third cash flow. Let's assume that at this point we have LIBOR that's updated, and LIBOR goes back to let's say 6%. If LIBOR goes back to 6%, what is the behavior of the cash flow at this point? Now, you can guess here, Apple is paying now a fixed rate, right, which is 6%. And how do we get to that 6%? Well, let's verify that it's actually 6%. Apple is going to be receiving from Citi, and they're going to be receiving LIBOR. And LIBOR is at 6%, which means they're going to be receiving half of that. So it's going to be plus 3%. That's what Apple is getting. They're going to be paying the fixed rate, and the fixed rate is at 5%, so they're going to be paying minus 2.5%. And they're going to be paying their loan. And the loan was, this closes out the swap. Those are our swaps. And our loan was at LIBOR plus 1%. Remember, LIBOR is 6% now. So we're going to do 6% plus 1%. That's 7%. Divided by 2. That's 3.5%. So minus 3.5%. And what is going to be our net amount here? Our net amount is going to be minus 3.5% minus 2.5% plus 3%. So that's going to be minus 6% plus 3%. That is minus 3%. So we still add minus 3% here, multiplied by 100 million, and we're still paying $3 million here. So our fixed rate for Apple is done. We know that Apple is paying a fixed rate no matter what LIBOR is. LIBOR went to 5 to 8, from 8 to 6. Our cash flow net outcome for Citi, for Apple, was always at 3 million. So Apple's objective is met. They converted what was going to be a liability at the floating rate, which is LIBOR plus 1%, to a fixed rate, which is a 6% fixed rate. Alright, how about Intel? Well, Intel is essentially going to convert that fixed rate that they had at 4%, which is that fixed rate that they had at 4% here, to a variable rate that's going to be LIBOR plus 1%. And you can do the same process with these same numbers and see what you get for Intel, essentially in terms of cash flows. The outcome that we looked at here was in terms of a percentage, which is the cost of the agreement here, and for Apple, in terms of cash flows, this is essentially the payment that they're going to have to incur over that period of time. And you could do the same for this last cash flow. You will find that they're still paying minus 3 million here as an outcome, cash flow outcome for Apple. All right. How about Intel? Well, play with Intel and check and verify that those Intel indeed does pay a floating rate and not a fixed rate of 4%. So let's go back to our slides and build up on that. We looked at what the swap agreement is intuitively, and we went back and worked the details of how it actually functions. And that's what a lot of this description is all about on the notes here. And the description that we had was an example of a plain vanilla interest rate swap. And so that is an agreement by two companies, Apple and agreeing to receive 6% LIBOR and pay a fixed rate of 5%. A 6-month LIBOR and pay a fixed rate of 5%. Now, my numbers are not going to match the numbers of my example here, and not going to match what we have on the notes here, but the idea is essentially the same. So receive a 6-month LIBOR and pay a fixed rate of 5%. Every 6 months for 3 years. Our example had the 2 years example, and we had the notional amount of 100 million. You know what the notional amount here is. Now, also note that at expiration here, the notional amount is not exchanged, right? Because it doesn't make sense at the end of the contract here that Apple essentially writes a check of 100 million to Citi, and Citi writes a check of 100 million to Apple. So that notional amount is not exchanged. What I exchange are the cash flows that I exchange. Now, between Apple and Citi, this is what gets exchanged, right? This portion here. So for this first cash flow here, nothing gets exchanged, because what's going to happen is the floating rate are going to cancel each other. What they're going to be receiving from Citi has to be is the same that has to be paid to Citi, so there's no outcome that is going to be exchanged between Apple and Citi. Here, however, there is an exchange that's going to occur. Now, Citi is going to be Apple is going to be receiving 4% from Citi and has to pay 2%, 2.5% to Citi. So the net outcome to Apple is going to be plus 1.5%. That is what they're going to be essentially receiving from Citi given the swap. And in this case, they are going to be receiving plus 0.5% from Citi based on the swap there. And the 0.5% they're going to be receiving are going to offset this negative 3.5% that they had to pay on their loan, and that's what is going to guarantee that they pay the fixed rate here. And the 1.5% they're receiving from Citi here is going to offset the minus 4.5% here and guarantee that they're actually paying the 3 million loan here, or the fixed rate of 3%. And at this point here, because the LIBOR rate is exactly 5%, is exactly equal to the fixed rate that they have to pay to Citi, then there's no exchange in cash flow at that point in time. All right, let's go back to the slides. And what we have in the next slides here is an illustration of what the cash flows are essentially going to look like. Now, we remember that whenever we talk about exchange of cash flows with respect to interest rate, day count convention matters, right? You remember the day count convention, 30 to 360, actual to actual, or actual to 360. Now, we're not going to consider those day count convention in this case. And so, how those cash flows going to be behaving? Well, in this case, we are exchanging a variable for a fix. So the fix is not going to change at any point in time. So we're starting here March 8 to September 8. So that's a period of 6 months, right? And another 6 months, and another 6 months, and so on and so forth. And here we have the floating rate, LIBOR, that they established for the year. And so the floating rate is going to be divided by 2 for the semi-annual rate. So that's how we get the 2.10. And the 2.10 is going to be received, and the fixed rate is going to be paid. So we have a positive sign here for the reception of the 2.1% floating, and we have a negative sign here for the payment of the fixed rate. So the fixed rate doesn't change, right? 2.5%, because we're paying 5% all the time. We're always going to be paying 2.5% every 6 months. That makes up a 5% annually. And here we're going to be having a cash flow of a floating rate of 2.4%. That's because at this junction here, we are looking at what LIBOR is at that time. And LIBOR is updated continuously. So LIBOR at this point in time is 4.8%, which means that we're going to be receiving half of the LIBOR rate in the next 6 months. That's why we're receiving it here. And we're still going to pay fixed rate. Now the net outflow between the two counterparties, that is in this case we're working with Apple and Citi, is going to be, for the first scenario, minus 0.4%, for the second scenario, minus 0.1%. And for the third scenario here, we're going to be receiving a net inflow of 0.15%, and so on and so forth. And this process here is exactly what we described here when we went from one period to another period to another period. And this let's go back to the slide here. The 0.4%, for example, that we have here is the equivalent of the 0% that we have here, right? Because that 0.4% represents the net of that swap agreement, the net outflow or inflow on the swap agreement. And for the next period, we have a plus 1.5%. That would be the equivalent of what we have here, right, for the next period, and then the next period, and so on and so forth. Now, if we wanted to consider the cash flow that is paid on the liability from both parties, we would include, say, for example, because we are receiving LIBOR here, we'll have to pay minus LIBOR plus a given amount. And so that would be our liability that needs to be taken care of, and the liability is essentially offset by this LIBOR that we're receiving. And so by receiving LIBOR here, we're canceling the LIBOR that we have to pay, and so we are left with a fixed rate that's equal to that plus this amount here. Now, why do we typically use interest rate swaps? Well, we typically use interest rate swaps essentially to convert liabilities from a fixed rate to a floating rate, or from a floating rate to a fixed rate. We could also convert investments from fixed rate to floating rate, or from floating rate to fixed rate. Now, so long as it's a cash flow that is floating, no matter whether it's a liability or an asset, so you can replace the term investment here with the term asset, and you would have the same principle. The idea is to convert a liability or an asset from a variable or floating rate to a fixed rate, or vice versa. Now, an example that we had here is a company, again, like Apple, that essentially perhaps has a loan that is, in this case, LIBOR plus X%, and they don't want to be paying LIBOR plus X%, they want to be paying fixed rate. So they enter into a swap agreement with Citi where they're paying a fixed rate and they're receiving a variable rate. That variable rate essentially offset what they have to pay here, and so that converts the loan to a fixed rate, which is equal to the 3% plus whatever it is that they have to pay here. So that is the example for a swap between Citi and Apple. Now, again, that's essentially the idea, right? Remember, they had a variable rate. They are receiving a variable rate. That's how we ensure that this cancels that one. And they have to pay, because that is a payment, and this is a payment. They have to pay essentially 3.1% fixed, right? And then they cancel the LIBOR. That is for this agreement between these two parties. And we could do the same for Intel. In respect to Intel, Intel is receiving a fixed rate, which means that they have a fixed rate loan here of X% that needs to be satisfied. They don't like the fixed rate, so they want a variable rate. And by doing that, what essentially they're going to have is they're going to convert this fixed rate into a variable rate that's going to be equal to LIBOR plus the difference between X that they are paying and the 2.94% that they are receiving. That's 2.97% that they are receiving. And so that is going to be the liability that they're going to have. LIBOR plus whatever is the difference between what they have to pay here and what they are receiving here. Now, if this is at 3.2%, the liability is essentially going to be equal to LIBOR, right? And so they have to pay 3.2%, but they are receiving 2.9% here, so it's going to be plus 3.2% minus 2.97%, and that is going to be what they end up paying. So overall, remember, this is a payment here, and that one is another payment. This is a reception, so they are receiving that amount. So they're converting this fixed rate to this variable rate or this floating rate. And that was an example. These were the scenarios where we had the liability, right? That's a liability because this is an outflow. Remember, you see the sign of the arrow here, that's an outflow. So we enter in this kind of agreement. Now, if it is an inflow, we are talking about an asset or an investment. Because it's an inflow, we have this arrow coming in. We don't quite want to receive the fixed rate, so we're going to be paying a fixed rate here, to get rid of that fixed rate. And we are going to be receiving, in exchange for the fixed rate, we're going to be receiving the variable rate here. And the reason we would do that is perhaps because this is an asset, and along with the asset, we also have a liability here that's another fixed rate of X%. And we want to offset this liability with this asset, so we're also going to enter into a swap agreement that's going to allow for us to be receiving the LIBOR that's also going to be used to make a payment here. Or maybe this is a LIBOR liability that needs to be taken care of. So we are exchanging this fixed rate for a LIBOR rate that's going to allow to satisfy this liability here. And the same for converting a LIBOR or variable rate asset into a fixed rate asset. Now we've been playing with this so far, and we talked about CD as the middleman, and essentially CD is going to play the role of a market maker. And CT plays the role of a market maker, so CT is going to connect these two entities, right? The CD is going to connect Apple. We had AAPL here, and CT is going to connect Apple to Intel, and CT is going to earn a spread, and we showed what that spread was like early on. Now you remember that here CT earned a 2%. And it's a 2% annual rate, which means that every semi-annual period when these exchanges occur, CT is actually going to earn a 2% on that same notional amount, which is 100 million. So 2% annually, so which means CT is going to take 1% semi-annually times 100 million, which is going to be 1 million. So for setting up this agreement, the fee quote that CD is going to charge is essentially that 1 million on that transaction every semi-annual period. All right, so as the market maker, CD is going to have to quote a bid and ask price quote or rate, and the bid rate is what CD is willing to pay, right? So that's going to be the fixed rate that CD is ready to pay, and the offer rate is what CD is willing to accept, right? So those are the fixed rate that CD is willing to pay, and those are the fixed rate that CD is willing to accept. And you see that here we have the offer rate that's higher than the fixed rate, so CD is willing to pay 2.5% and accept 2.58%. So it's plus 2.58% minus 2.55%, and the spread here is 0.03%, or essentially 3 basis points. So the 3 basis point difference here is what CD earns on the transaction. The quoted rate though, the quoted fixed rate, is going to be the midpoint or the average between the 2.55 and the 2.58. So this value here is the average between this bid and the offer price. Now, so far we've also made ignore day count convention, but you remember that you have to account for day count convention, which is not going to work with an example here. But what are the day count conventions, and why is it that they're important? They're important because the fixed rate market utilizes a day count convention that's different from the floating rate market. And typically what we have is the floating rate market is going to use the actual to 360. That's why we have the LIBOR here, which is a floating rate, is going to use the actual to 360, whereas the fixed rate market is going to use the other two conventions, which are 30 to 360 or actual to actual. And this will be for our fixed rate market. And for our floating rate market, we're going to have essentially actual to 360. And the reason for that is simply because LIBOR is a money market rate. And you remember that LIBOR is a London interbank offer rate. That's the rate at which banks borrow and lend over with each other. So it is essentially a money market rate. That is why you remember from that last unit, LIBOR utilizes the actual to 360. Confirmations are essentially specify the terms of the transactions, and those terms are as detailed in the agreement. The international swaps and derivatives has developed master agreement to facilitate the establishment of the swap transaction that can be used to cover all agreements between two counterparties. and CCPs, central counterparties. You remember from our discussion in the previous unit that CCPs were essentially introduced this after the 2008 crisis, right, where there were very little oversight over these transactions that happen over the counter, and so CCP solved now the role of the clearinghouse in futures market. And so what we have here is that CCPs are going to require things like margin, right? Initial margin and maintenance margin for both sides of the transaction, just in order to mitigate credit risk or counterparty risk. All right, so I think this is a good time to stop here. I'm gonna stop here for this video, and when we come back, we're gonna talk a little more about how it is that why really an organization would consider swapping a fixed rate versus a variable rate. So far we've said, well, Apple doesn't want a fixed rate, but why does Apple not want a fixed rate? Or why would Apple not want a fixed rate but rather prefer a variable rate? Or why would Intel not want a variable rate but rather prefer a fixed rate, or vice versa? So we're going to talk about the reasons why those might occur, and then we're going to talk about the valuation of interest rate swaps, and also talk about bootstrapping LIBOR rate or LIBOR forward rates, with working with an example in the next video. All right, I'll see you in the next video to continue this discussion in unit 9. See you in the next video.